So when we last left our heroes, George Bush was president. Things were going relatively well, with the exception of the drug crisis, which we hadn't really gotten a handle on, and the personal computer had come out. But the defining moment of the George Bush presidency was obviously his victory, or our victory, in the Cold War. And by victory in the Cold War, I mean the Soviet Union finally collapsed in the late 19, or I guess it technically fell apart in the early 1990s, but the Soviet bloc was falling apart in the late 80s. Uh, the Soviet Union had been stagnating for a significant period of time. After Brezhnev, you had a series of really old, not that engaged leaders who were sort of put into the top spot because of seniority, and so they did very little to reform the Soviet Union. But in '85, you get Mikhail Gorbachev, who is a reformer, a true believer in communism, but also a reformer, who was trying to do some similar things in the Soviet Union to the reforms that had really happened in China in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So Gorbachev had basically two policies, something called glasnost, or openness, which allowed more free speech, more foreign contact, more ability to criticize the government, things like that, and perestroika, which is restructuring. So glasnost is openness, allowing people to speak more freely, and perestroika, which tried to add some more elements of capitalism into the economy to create more incentives. Both of these policies might have been effective, but the problem is there was already too much sort of anger at the Soviet Union at this point, and they just furthered the collapse. So when people could criticize the government, they started criticizing the government, and many people thought that perestroika was not moving fast enough. In Gorbachev's defense, he was hampered by conservative elements within the party who didn't want to move in this direction. So, in the end, both of them probably good ideas. Both of them failed. The Berlin Wall fell. This the symbol of communism came down in the late, no, sorry, in '89, and this really, well, this was a real symbol of the collapse of the Second World. So, in '91, so most of these other former Soviet satellites had already abandoned communism. The Soviet Union itself broke up in 1991 with Gorbachev leaving power and a guy named Boris Yeltsin becoming president of Russia. Obviously, the story is much more complicated than that, but you really don't need to know those details for the story of American history. So, Soviet Union collapses. They try to form a new sort of capitalist commonwealth, but most of the former Soviet republics break away and become independent. So, and then, of course, as you know, Russia is now a thriving democracy with no lingering corruption or authoritarianism. As far as other foreign policy goes, the Bush administration was incredibly effective. We have the first Gulf War, which was really important in American history. The first Gulf War involves America's best friend, Saddam Hussein, who you remember is the president of Iraq, invading his oil rich neighbor to the south, Kuwait. Kuwait had been carved off from Iraq in order to separate out the oil wealth that Kuwait has from Iraq, who after World War One, they didn't the British didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket, so they created this new country, Kuwait. And in '91, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. The United States, it was technically United Nations, a series of United Nations forces, but led by the United States, initiates something called Operation Desert Storm, where we go in to basically force Saddam to pull out of Kuwait. And so there was a few moments where we basically issued a series of threats to Saddam. There's a lot of questions as far as like why Saddam Hussein thought he could invade Kuwait, but the basic understanding is that he thought he had tacit American approval to do this. Turns out he didn't. We tried to intimidate him out and then launched Operation Desert Storm, which was a massive sort of a series of airstrikes followed by a massive ground invasion, which obliterated the Iraqi army, and it sort of dispelled Vietnam syndrome. The United States had been very hesitant to issue sort of these, to initiate these sort of foreign interventions since Vietnam, lest we get dragged into another really unpopular, unwinnable quagmire. But the Gulf War was over incredibly quickly, was incredibly decisive for the United States, and therefore sort of dispelled this notion of American weakness. And especially right on the cusp of the fall of the Soviet Union, really cemented the United States as the hegemon, the world superpower that was more or less untouchable. So, Gulf War, incredibly positive for Bush. He passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which made it illegal to discriminate against Americans with disabilities and set up a series of government laws and regulations as far as accommodations that needed to be provided for people. So, incredibly positive there. But what sunk the Bush presidency was a massive recession that hit right at the end of the 1980s. A series of issues as far as deregulation goes created a speculative bubble. You know, deregulation throughout the Reagan years created a speculative bubble. The bubble burst. We had this massive crash right here. And unfortunately for Bush, he had, while running for president, uh, in order to be clever, I guess, had this line at the nominating convention that said like, "Read my lips, no new taxes." There was this whole thing. He went through this whole rigmarole. It was like, they're going to ask me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they're going to ask me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they're going to ask me to raise taxes, and I'll say, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then the economy crashed. Massive. The government started running massive deficits, and Bush raised taxes. And this was utterly devastating to him because, of course, you've got him on tape saying one thing, and then he clearly does something else. And in the late 1980s and early 90s, that was something that Americans cared about. Bush tried to turn this around by encouraging individuals to give back to their community, sort of a crowdsourcing economic growth thing with his daily points of light, where he highlighted individuals doing heroic things to bring America back. But in general, it was seen as Bush not doing enough. And so the economy was still tanking as we approached the election of 1992. Bush is going to get the Republican nod because, again, he was a relatively competent, strong president despite the poor economic situation. The Democrats are going to nominate William Jefferson Clinton of Arkansas after a very, very contentious sort of a campaign where Clinton was far behind in the nomination process and then ended up securing the nomination, getting his first nickname of the comeback kid. The person who most awesomely defined the election of 92 is Texas billionaire Ross Perot. Ross Perot created his own independent party called the Reform Party. He, man, what do I need to say about Ross Perot? I'll post links, but like he ran these 30-minute infomercials, which are basically just him going through a series of charts talking about how the economy is falling apart and we need to balance the budget. And so he ran on a platform of fiscal responsibility. And oh man, he actually, it seemed like he had a shot as an independent candidate. And then there was this weird moment where he dropped out of the election for some reason and then jumped back in at the last moment. And there's a whole series. If you're interested, you should look at Ross Perot because it's a crazy story. Because when he jumps. So he's in the nomination. He jumps out and says he's not going to run. Then he jumps back in at the last minute, right before the election, and loses all his momentum. So the end result of this is just a real hot mess. Because Clinton just emphasizes the economy and talks about how he's going to, how he's going to bring Americans back to prosperity. And Clinton also really tried to focus on, was one of the first candidates to really poll people and try to figure out what issues mattered to them and then focus on those issues. So here's your result in 92. I'll give you a moment to soak it in, but there's some crazy stuff going on there. I mean, the electoral vote really doesn't tell the story. Perot's Reform Party getting almost 20% of the popular vote was just really demonstrates how disenchanted people had sort of become with both parties. Clinton's plurality of the popular vote clearly doesn't give a huge mandate to govern. And it shows in the end the weakness of Bush and how, this spoiler candidate can really make headway, especially when the economy is not doing as well as, people would like it to. So now we've got William Jefferson Clinton as president. And man, he's an interesting guy. One of our younger presidents. He had a somewhat tumultuous time as governor of Arkansas. There were a series of both eventually sexual harassment scandals that came out, and also the Whitewater scandal, which involved a somewhat like a potential him giving breaks to this development company in exchange for kickbacks. It launched a massive investigation that pretty much was ongoing throughout Clinton's entire presidency. So that's going to be hang somewhat of a cloud over the Clinton administration. He's also going to be fighting with Congress for pretty much the middle 6 years of his terms. So Clinton and the Democrats win in '92, but in '94, a guy named Newt Gingrich launches a massive sort of conservative counter push, basically arguing that the Democrats are behaving irresponsibly. We need to balance the budget. He came up with this thing called the Contract with America, which laid out a series of principles. And these principles really allowed conservative Americans to rally back, got Gingrich to be Speaker of the House, and led to some pretty fierce budget battles with Clinton having to significantly trim the federal government and eventually actually balancing the budget, although a lot of that was due to economic growth, which we'll be talking about tomorrow. So, these budget battles defined the early years of the Clinton administration and led to a government shutdown, which ended up actually backfiring and hurting the Republicans pretty significantly during this time period. And so Democrats would be swept back into power, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. We're going to start and finish. We're going to finish out today with a series of Clinton policy failures. Before tomorrow, we look at some of the Clinton policy successes that actually ensured him a second term. So, policy failures for Clinton. Racial issues were some of the really big pieces here. Racial animosity had been growing to some degree since the late 1980s as economic and social gains that other people had been getting had been not shared by African Americans. And despite all of the massive gains of the civil rights movement, African Americans still lagged significantly behind a lot of other people in the United States. We'd sort of seen the improvements that they had made level off and even decrease to some degree in the 80s and 90s. The Rodney King beating was one example of how the United States had not progressed as far as we had sort of hoped to at the end of the civil rights era. Rodney King was pulled over by the LAPD, and of course, you can look it up if you're interested. It's a complicated story, but he resists arrest and ends up being beaten for about 15 minutes by LAPD officers, and it is all caught on tape. So despite the fact that there's this video of Rodney King being beaten, photos of Rodney King being beaten, he is acquitted by the police. Sorry, the police officers are acquitted of using excessive force, and Los Angeles erupts in riots. And so people across the country watch the news as LA erupts into flames as if it was 1968. And there's a real question as far as like why are we, how do we solve these problems, right? Why have we not made any progress in the past 20 years? So, Rodney King, it was one of these issues, one of these conflicts that highlighted these issues. The OJ trial is another one. OJ Simpson was a football player who was convicted of murdering his wife or ex-wife. Honestly, I don't really know the details of the OJ trial. There's a television series on it. So if you're interested, The People versus OJ Simpson. Actually, I think there's like a number of different television series that have been released. But despite happening during my childhood, I never followed it all that closely. I know a couple things. One, uh, he was acquitted partially because of a bloody glove that was found that he was able to imply did not fit him, partially because of his high-priced legal team, and the acquittal of O.J. Simpson, and also partially because of some racist statements made by the lead investigator. That was a key factor too, I believe. But a majority of Americans, disagreed with the verdict. And this disagreement kind of went sharply down racial lines, sort of again highlighting the difference or the differences in opinions between African Americans and white people. Finally, the divide over rap music became sort of a cultural touch point. Rap music obviously did not originate in the 1990s, but it significantly grew in popularity with groups like NWA and then, of course, Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls becoming international celebrities. And there were a number of reasons why some people started to think that rap music was a negative effect, has having a negative effect on our culture. Part of it was the lyrics and the focus on violence and some opinions expressed by groups like NWA about the police. And some of it was the violence that surrounded rap music, as both Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur were killed in gang-related shootings. And so rap music became sort of a cultural touch point that people could point to say that clearly there's still this racial divide in the United States. Dealing with issues of homosexuality, the Clinton administration also failed. They passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as between one man and one woman, which clearly created again a strong divide between people who held that opinion and also people who were pushing for greater acceptance for LGBTQ people. And the military passed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which allowed gay people to serve in the military, but they couldn't be openly gay. So we're not going to ask about your sexual orientation, and as long as you don't volunteer any information, we're good, I guess. I don't know. It took that policy was only repealed during the Obama administration, and healthcare reform was a massive failure. Um, the first lady Hillary Clinton took on healthcare reform as one of her key issues. And the Clintons pushed for expansion of healthcare, potentially a government option or more a public option, or more government regulation over healthcare. And they utterly failed to make any progress on that. So we laid out all Clinton's policy failures, and we'll cut it off here for time and jump back in tomorrow and look at some of Clinton's foreign policy and then some successes and try to move closer to the year 2000.